let's come back to squaring makes a frame, makes a referential way to have pictures. Being attentive to it, we're able to see, to perceive of what the square of attention, what the frame of reference, what the square, which is really a pair of pairs, brought together. So spatiality, to be clear, requires a square. Time, on the other attractor, on the other hand, almost as if it were like a balancing chirality to the chirality of space. And hence, the paired chiralities are the way in which a magnetoelectric energy works. And the squaring, the space-time, is the way in which the framing. And one can not only have a frame, a square, but one can have a weaving, a fabric, which is a fabric of space-time, where the warp that maintains itself is the space, and the weft that is woven into it is the time, and so space-time then has a fabric, as Einstein, in his two theories of relativity, delivered in 1905 and a little bit later. And that fabric of space-time, as we talked about in the second presentation last week, receives gravity as an indentation. And there are times when what is so highly gravitic in phenomenality that it really almost collapses, and in fact sometimes does collapse the fabric of space-time, and one has a black hole. And the well, mathematically, is not just that it penetrates through to something else, it gets absorbed in infinity. That is a high Dharma clue. An infinite field is a great puzzle. It's matched by a zero field, which is a great mystery. Those who are paying attention to the zero field of completeness, they like mystery stories, and those who are paying attention to the infinite field like science fiction. One of the most profound things that Stephen Jay Gould came up with his other two musketeers, Elizabeth Verba and Niles Eldredge, especially Gould and Eldredge being the spear point of it, and she being the heft of the way in which the elan was throwing that spear into a penetration beyond the mental targets that could have been met but were deceptive because of that. They penetrated through and came up with a great high Dharma transform of the theory of evolution, that it isn't continuous, but that there are punctuations of equilibrium that open up the whole possibility of evolution to something sudden, not reducible to a mutation, not reducible to genes, just genes, not reducible to DNA or even all the varieties of RNA. They called it a punctuated equilibrium. There is something in equilibria which is symmetrical, which is unifiable. One can understand. One has a very good, not just a perception, but a conception. But what staggers conception and dazzles perception is something like punctuated equilibrium, where there is a supersymmetry. And in that unmeasurable interstice that, to use the jargon, transcends all the onion levels and layers faster than all at once, spontaneously, from the spirit of cosmic kaleidoscopic differential consciousness, emerges spontaneously something new. Wasn't there before. And that macroevolution becomes one of the great concerns then, that one needs to at first try to factor in punctuated equilibria, and then one has to absorb and transform all of the jargon-based mapping that one has done previously, because it just, not only does it not hold water, it especially doesn't hold wine, and it cannot ever hold the cognac. And if you're going to get around to having the joy of toasting each other in presence, you need to get the wine at least, and the cognac hopefully. One of the 20 or 30 books by Niles Eldredge is Macroevolutionary Dynamics. Species, Niches, and Adaptive Peaks. There is an adaptive peak that is the punctuated equilibria that leads to an openness without limit. Space-time has nothing to say. Public or private has nothing to say whatsoever. And especially mental manipulations to corral everything into a really powerful frame of reference gets evaporated, not shattered. It just loses steam, then it loses the steam engine, then it loses the people that want to have a steam engine. This is a couple of the chapters of Eldredge's wonderful volume, published in 1989, Macroevolution, Some Basic Considerations. Adaptation and Organismic Macroevolution 1, The Modern Synthesis and the Transformation of Morphology. Just to base oneself on a morphing is literally sandbox play. Yes, morphing is much better than moving around little stick figures and little Monopoly pieces on some kind of a board. Morphing is just a faster game. until it has not only a transformation, but a double transform. Adaptation and organismistic macroevolution 2, ultra-Darwinism, and the rates and timing of adaptive change. Perhaps the most important fundamental dimension, time, needs to be understood, and to be understood that the mathematics of cubing time and squaring space ratio to the real 1, which emerges pure, lucidly from 0 spontaneously. You can have all of the ratios of the 1, 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 1/5, and in music it goes up to 1/10. You can have that kind of fractionating, but it's a fractionating of 1, which emerges cleanly out of a fertile 0 field. The 1 is not a field. 0 is not a point. It's a field, fertile, made fertile by infinity, by an infinite field. Chapter 4, species, speciation, and transformational stasis and change. Transformational stasis and change. Ready, set, go man go. It's like 3 stages. One needs to be able to get the readiness set, then the change occurs spontaneously. There's no trigger to pull. There is no payoff to pay. There's no corruption to be successful or not successful. All of that is, I think the word used to be falderal. It's more than extraneous. So that when one comes to 21st century understanding of evolution, one of the most important volumes to come out, it was 2005 when it came out, is called Phyla, on the origins of phyla. And James W. Valentine, published by the University of Chicago Press, and it's a monstrously beautiful, comprehensive volume. It'll be the standard way in which one matures the understanding of evolution for a long ways into the 21st century. The very first part, part 1, evidence of the origins of metazoan phyla. And number 1, under part 1, the nature of phyla. Phyla are morphologically based branches of the tree of life. Genealogical histories can be traced in trees which are positional structures. Natural biological hierarchies are nested structures of functional entities that emerge when complex systems are organized. When the integral of complex systems is organized, new dimensions emerge, which recursively transform what your complexities were and what your organization was into what could be. And it's not about having just statistical possibilities. Part 2, design elements in body plans of phyla. Cells are the basic building blocks of metazoan bodies. Cells. There's a great international science journal called Cell. Cells are integrated into tissues by protein bindings or matrices. Metazoans have several major types of tissues. Organs and organ systems are formed of tissues. Organisms are best understood as developmental systems. We're developing. We're developing so that there is an openness of approaching a differential conscious infinite field. And one of the previous aeons' great architectural structures, recognizing that, was built by the right-hand man of Augustus Caesar. His right-hand man was the naval general of the Roman Empire at its founding, but he was also the greatest architect in Rome. At its founding, his name was Marcus Agrippa. And Marcus Agrippa was, as they used to say, rock-solid genius, dependable. Augustus brought him into his family, giving a daughter in marriage to him, which, because of her, it didn't work, because of her. But Agrippa was always there, and his building that he built 2,000 years ago is still there in Rome today, still intact. Though it has had lots of changes of costume on the inside, the architecture is still monumentally lucid. It is the pantheon. It is the temple of no particular god or goddess, but all gods and goddesses in their entourage. And the great dome is built of a quality of granulated rock and other ingredients that made it kind of a Roman cement. And the building itself is monumentally huge on the inside. The pillars were fashioned especially in the only place in the world that knew how to fashion big, huge, cylindrical pillars that were more than 35, 40 feet high. And they held the great circle of the structure, and out of that great circle of the structure, which was held really well, was lifted this dome out of the Roman cement that tapered its formula as one went up to the top, and then as one got to the crust of the dome, a kind of volcanic pumice, oddly enough, from the very district that would inundate Pompeii in 79 AD from a volcano. And that pumice came not to a top knot, but came to an opening that was left completely open. So that the crown of the Pantheon was an open-spaced circle. The weather could come in. It rains on the marble floor whenever it rains in Rome of the Pantheon. It's lasted all this time. And was so built because when it came time to build a tomb for Virgil, Virgil, who wrote, among other things, the justifying epic of the Roman Empire, the Aeneid. Aeneas fleeing from a devastated Troy, devastated by the Greeks, the incredible, ferocious and voracious Greeks like Agamemnon and Menelaus and Achilles. From the Troy that had fallen in Homer's epics, Aeneas came back and reestablished what became the beginnings of Rome in the Aeneid. And so the Roman Empire under Virgil's epic is the inheritor of what was the great power in the world and was interrupted by the Greeks. And now we've come back and we're going to transform what the Greeks had transformed from the previous world order back into a sophisticated further world order, the Augustan world. The Agrippa-built Pantheon was based on Virgil's tomb that was based in what is today the outskirts of Naples. North of Naples is a great lava field. And that lava field is volcanic. And as a volcanic field, it is possible, and was possible very early on, and a mystic tunnel was carved through the pumice so that it had a special kind of arching where it arched, but instead of coming to a Roman curve arch, it had a little key stone like a lock. You'll find it in Mayan architecture as well. That sometimes it's called the labrum, the Arch of Labrum. And that in repetitions down the way into a natural cave in the volcanic eruption that had dozens, if not scores, of side passages coming off the central cave where the Sibyl of Cumae held her court. So that when she spoke, whatever she said would have echoes beyond comprehension. And that only someone who would have heard her personally, originally, with a spontaneous and then instant memory, would know what she had said. If you were a split second late, all you would hear would be the cacophony increasing. It's a great symbol of a new age, of a new aeon. The cacophony increases by those who have not originally heard. There are, near the surface of that little insert in the top of the cave of skylights leading out so that natural light floods in the daytime in such a way that there's a kind of a luminescence of that tunnel going into the cave of 100 mouths where the Sibyl would be. Underneath where the Sibyl's cave is, very close by, is a lake, Lake Avernus, which has very dark waters, volcanically heated and darkened by minerals. And Virgil's tomb is right there above the Sibyl of Cumae's cave, and his tomb has an openness at the center of its dome where the weather can come in, and that's how Agrippa built the Pantheon, by moving Virgil's tomb architecture into the very center of Rome and making about at least 20 or maybe 30 times the size. we're going to see in a month or so the remaking of Cosmos by Carl Sagan after 35 years. It's going to be presented by the Hayden Planetarium in New York City. Its director is Neil deGrasse Tyson. And the net is full of material on Tyson, on Cosmos being remade. Cosmos, when it came out by Carl Sagan, has reached more than 600 million people since 1980 when it came out. And the person who's seeing to the remake of Cosmos is Carl Sagan's surviving widow, Anne Druyan. And Anne Druyan and Carl Sagan together did a book called Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. And its great subtitle, A Search for Who We Are. And in this, there is a series of dedications, but Cosmos has the great dedication at its beginning. And it reads, for Anne Druyan, in the vastness of space and the immensity of time, it is my joy to share a planet and an epoch with Annie. The major influence on Cosmos by Carl Sagan was a series done by David Attenborough, Life on Earth. It was done for BBC. They're all 13-part series because the metronome for university-level education was the seminar, and the seminar set was the 13-week season. The original university, Renaissance-style university, was not like the medieval university based on ideology, but the Renaissance universities were based on a vision. And the vision was to take the cycle of the seasons of nature and to represent them, not in a representation, but to present again the way in which one can understand. And the great origin of David Attenborough's Life on Earth was that he was in charge of the BBC when it was first mooted in the mid-1960s that they needed to have a new style of television programming from what in the 1950s and early 1960s had become like gunk of all these half-hour pseudo-comedies, all these game shows, etc., etc. And they wanted to have something that was classically monumental to be able to present to a worldwide audience the high points of civilization. And so the first series that was done under David Attenborough was called Civilization, and its subtitle was A Personal View. And for that, they decided that the only person that they knew who could present this consistently on that high level was Lord Kenneth Clark. Kenneth Clark, who had studied for years under one of the most sophisticated of the early 20th century aesthetes, Bernard Berenson. And Berenson had positioned himself in Florence, in Italy, to try to understand the Renaissance especially. And it was at that time that many writers of great talent and genius were beginning to reassess Jacob which stimulated them to try to understand what really is the pivotal quality of the Renaissance, which must then be the pivotal quality of civilization. And so Civilization, A Personal View was the way in which art generates civilization, by Lord Clarke, Sir Kenneth, in 13 parts. It was released in the, begun in 1966 and finished about 1959, late 58, 68, 69. Due to David Attenborough, Lord Clarke got all the funding he needed to go to all the locations and to show how, since the Renaissance, one has come to then the middle of the 20th century with a great appreciation that we are really coming to a maturity that is staggering in Renaissance terms. And the next 13-part series, just before Life on Earth and just after Civilization, was Jacob Bernowski's The Ascent of Man, where he took science, like Lord Clarke had taken art, that science also is a transform, another transform of civilization. So that by the time of the early 1970s, one had the transform of art from vision and the transform of science from history, and one was prepared that the 20th century and all of this time form sense, especially the acceleration of the Renaissance, all the way back to the beginnings when Virgil's tomb and the Pantheon and all the other qualities of that era were brought together, not to tie a knot, but to open up a portal. And when we come next week, we'll take a look at how one of the classics of that portal in its high Dharma maturity was the Bodhicaryavatara by Santideva. This is a commentary by the Dalai Lama on the 9th of 10 chapters of the Bodhicaryavatara. Now begins an explanation of personal identitylessness. More next week.